Our second scripture reading is from the Gospel according to Matthew. No, it's not. From the book of Ruth. We already read Matthew. Sorry. From the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 22 to chapter 2, verse 9. Listen now for the word of the Lord. So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I might find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our home would never be featured in the holiday edition of Southern Living. There is no fancy white and gold decorations adorning our halls. It's a lot of red and a lot of green. We're not going to be featured in the Home Goods ad with the perfect tree where all the ornaments match and the tree is wrapped in beautiful ribbon. We're not able to post pictures of our house on Instagram to elicit the envy of the neighbors or to show ourselves as possible interior decorators you might want to emulate. To put a positive spin on it, you might say that our home is whimsical in its holiday decorations. Others might say tacky or kitschy. But I'm not embarrassed about this. If I was, I wouldn't be talking about it in front of 300 people or more this morning. Because what our house does have is stories. You see, our decorations might look like they belong in a grandma house because they were decorations of our grandmas. The giant overstuffed Santa Claus, the elves on the ladders next to the fireplace, the 38-year-old artificial tree in the dining room, the candlesticks with the fake holly around the base. Come over and you'll learn who we are and where we come from and why we are the way we are. This year I came home late from a session meeting in November. The kids were getting ready for bed upstairs. I came in the door and I noticed that the step stool was at the base of the bookcases in the living room. It doesn't belong there. It's supposed to be in the bathroom to climb up to wash your hands. And then I noticed next to the step stool there were 4 plastic reindeer and the faded Santa on his side holding the reins. Those reindeer had been my grandmother's. They're plastic, they're hard to get to stand up. They've faded with age. Santa's suit is missing a lot of its fur. One of the antlers on one of the reindeer has come off. The nose on the lead reindeer is pink because my dad, when he was a little boy, took his mother's fingernail polish, her red fingernail polish, and dabbed the tip of the lead reindeer's nose so that he would be Rudolph. It's faded to pink over the decades. The evidence showed that our 5-year-old, Ruth, had wanted to play with those reindeer and Santa. So she'd gotten the step stool, she'd climbed up, she'd taken it down, and she'd played with it. She played with those reindeer just like her granddaddy had done when he was a little boy. She wanted to play with Eloise's reindeer, which felt right, her name being Ruth Eloise. So yeah, I'll take my tacky Christmas house, and I'll leave the southern living to some of the rest of you. Because stories get passed down that way. Stories of who we are and what makes us who we are. Frankly, I lament the lives of folks who don't have those stories, generation to pass on, who are trapped in a perpetual present, out with the old, in with the new, always purging, always clearing out. How do they know who they are? Maybe they don't. Maybe we forget. Now, whether you have decorations that you've passed down in your house or stories that you've passed down, you are part of a generational story today because you're part of the Christian story. And the generational story that we're hearing today has a common element in it in Scripture with this town of Bethlehem. According to Matthew, Bethlehem is where Joseph and Mary live. The story of Joseph and Mary traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem for a census, that's the way Luke tells the story. According to Matthew, Joseph already lives in Bethlehem, and his family's lived there for many generations, all the way back before there was a king on the throne in Israel, all the way back to when the first Israelites came into the promised land. And back in the past, a past that would have been made present to Joseph in his own life, he would have learned the story of Ruth the Moabite. Ruth was the daughter-in-law of Bethlehem native Naomi. And after all the men in their lives die, Naomi returns to her hometown of Bethlehem with persistent Ruth in tow. Ruth refusing to leave and go back to her native Moabite people. The story makes it very clear that Ruth does not belong in Bethlehem. 5 times in the verses we read today, Moab is referenced as a place associated with Ruth. In fact, it's the distinguishing characteristic that identifies her to Boaz. Ruth goes out into the fields to glean. Gleaning was a practice in ancient Israel. The law commanded that you leave the edges of your fields unharvested so that the poor and the widows could come and take what they needed for themselves. Ruth goes out with those Israelite widows to glean. Boaz of Bethlehem comes out to the field. He's a wealthy man. He owns the field, and he notices this woman there, and he asks his manager about her, and the manager says, yes, she came and asked to glean with the other women, but what has stood out to the manager is that she has been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. She's an outsider. She's a hard worker, not to be outdone, persistent, maybe even stubborn. We hear of Boaz's kindness to her, promising her a spot in the field to come back and glean, and offers her protection. Now, if you've ever heard this story before, you know this is just the beginning of Boaz and Ruth's relationship. Nicholas Sparks could not craft a better narrative. Eventually, Boaz and Ruth are married. Boaz marries Ruth the Moabite. He becomes salvation for this woman who had very little possibility for her own life or to care for her widowed mother-in-law. Persistent Ruth, compassionate Boaz. But why does Boaz do this? Is this just a testament to the grace of God at work in his life, drawing these two together in love? Maybe. But maybe it's also because Boaz carries a story in him that shapes how he sees the world. You see, Boaz's mother is not an Israelite either. Go back with me one more generation. In the time when Joshua, who takes over from Moses as the leader of the Israelites, is preparing the people to enter the promised land, he sends spies into Jericho Those spies are taken in and hidden by a prostitute in Canaan named Rahab. She takes a risk. She hides stubbornly these spies, and then, frankly, she lies to the police when they come asking about their whereabouts. When the Israelites march into Jericho and the walls come a-tumbling down, Rahab's house is spared. We learn that later, Rahab the Canaanite marries an Israelite named Salmon. Together they have a son, and they name him Boaz. If your mother is a risk-taking, lying Canaanite prostitute, then it might not be that far of a stretch to think that a persistent, cunning Moabite widow could be your wife. These stories shape how we understand ourselves and who we are in the world. Joseph knows those stories. Matthew makes that very clear because the verses we read right before the passage we heard today gives us the family tree of Joseph, and it says right there, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. There are 4 women named in this genealogy in Matthew. 2 of them are right here, the cunning Canaanite and the Moabite widow. And oh yeah, they are the great and great-great-grandparents of King David, the Bethlehem shepherd boy turned warrior king. This is Joseph's stock. These are the stories, the decor that surround his life daily in those Bethlehem hills where he lives. This is how he knew who he was and who his people were and how he was to go about his life. He wasn't stuck in the present, prone to take on the next shiny trinket before him. He had a deeply rooted history. And never was that history so important as when Joseph finds out that his betrothed, Mary, is pregnant and he is not the father. An angel comes to Joseph in a dream and explains the situation. Joseph wakes up and very casually we read, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife. Now, if you know first century Jewish custom and law, Mary being pregnant before she is married would make her an outsider within her community in Bethlehem. Her life would now be a scandal, and to marry her would mean that Joseph's life would become a scandal as well. So isn't this courageous for him to take Mary as his wife, an act of protection and care? Yes. And no. Because I believe when Moses woke up from that dream and saw the sun rising over those Bethlehem hills and the women going out into the fields to glean, he remembered Grandma Ruth. He remembered Grandma Rahab, whose cunning made it possible for his own people to ever come into the promised land at all. Yes, he was doing something uncustomary and risky in his day, but it was nothing that his ancestors, Boaz and Salmon, had not done in their own way, in their own time, too. Their act of risky righteousness led to King David. Joseph's act of risky righteousness leads to Jesus. Without the knowledge of these stories, how would Joseph's life have played out? Y'all, I don't care how you decorate your house for Christmas. But I do care deeply about what stories you're giving your kids and about what stories you are telling and retelling to shape who you are as a person. Because those generational stories we tell either mold us towards faith or they close us to the possibility of the Spirit's intervention. And we want to provide opportunities for you to encounter that story, to live that story. That's why Mr. Dillon and Miss Lee are wrangling 35, 40 kids for a Christmas pageant in a couple of weeks. It's why over 50 of y'all have shown up to the Advent Creations class to make daily questions you can ask around the table as you light your Advent wreath. It's why you dedicate a poinsettia in memory of a loved one so that their story is not forgotten, at least not yet this year. It's why youth are going to put on tacky sweaters and funny hats and go from house to house through a progressive dinner, creating bonds of fellowship and friendship with each other that might just well last a lifetime. It's why every year you make these alternative gifts and you bring in the bicycle with your kid so they know what we're doing in this Advent season. It's why the choir prepares this concert for next week. It's why there's a stable outside the narthex with stuffed animals in it and a horse that the kids are going to climb on every single year. Because the story of God's presence among us, Emmanuel, is the story to shape every day of our lives. It is the story to cling to when we grow petty and selfish, surly and sullen. It is the hope we hold to in rejection and guilt and grief and despair. It is the orientation story that draws us back to each other and heals old hurts and divisions. If we lose those stories, if we lose this place, if we lose all these traditions, we will not have the tools in our moral imagination to deal with all the hardships and challenges that are guaranteed to come up throughout a lifetime. So find these stories. Keep telling them until they saturate the lives of all those you love. It is the key to righteousness.